Hey guys, Jay here once again. Thanks for tuning in. And today we're going to be going through the functional anatomy of the IT band. So let's dive right in. All right, so let's start upstairs. Let's start up top with the IT band, the iliotibial band anatomy. So, trying to get this guy's hand out of the way. So on the front, we've got the TFL. No, it's not Transport for London. It stands for tensile fascia latae. These names, they always crack me up. Now, the TFL, I think at this point, a lot of people are familiar with this term. Actually, it's a common muscle that crops up in the context of self-myofascial release, and this is muscle. I call it the pocket muscle because you put your hand in your pocket, it's pretty much lying right underneath there. So if we just zoom in a little bit closer, you can see there it is. And I remember this phrase, this little mnemonic I was taught in anatomy, which is tensor fascia lata, gluteus medius min, all abduct the femur and help rotate it in. And that just gives you a little idea about the actions that this muscle produces. So abduction is when your leg comes out to the side. Hip flexion, obviously, is when the leg just comes upwards. And then internal rotation is, of course, rotating it inwards. So that's the insertion that we have from the front aspect of the TFL into the IT band, which you can see just here. Moving on then, if we head round to the back portion, we've got the glute max, and it tends to be particularly the superior fibers of the glute max that insert into the IT band here. We've got a lot of attachment through this region here, and the glute max has various different functions. You can see the fibers actually run in this kind of oblique direction. They're not straight down. They're not in a vertical alignment like the hamstrings. They actually do come across in this kind of diagonal fashion, which means that if you were to just even think about, for example, just get rid of these for a second. If you were to say, okay, these fibers are going to shorten, you can see that actually it's going to produce this sort of external rotation of the hip. So it externally rotates the hip, it extends the hip. That's just what happens when you stand up from a squat or from a deadlift or whatever it may be. And there's a portion of a certain amount of abduction, leg coming out to the side, that occurs through this muscle here. Then finally, if we come out of this, we've got also the iliac portion. So it's glute medius here. The iliac crest, let me just get it on. There we go. The iliac crest is, if I just fade the others, that's a bit better. There we go, that's good. This is the the iliotibial part. The eye, in other words, we're referring, of course, to the iliac crest, which is just up here, and you can see we've got some insertion of that iliotibial band into that portion as well. If we start to make our way down the IT band and have a look at the distal attachment points, or the ones closest to the knee itself, there's a couple. So the first point to mention is you can see the kneecap right here, the patella. And can you see that there is an insertion into this outer aspect? We've got the patella retinaculum here. It's just some of the connective tissue around the kneecap. So you can see there's part of the IT band inserts into that outer portion of the kneecap. The second insertion point is down here on the shin on a point called Gerdy's tubercle. And the third attachment point is actually just onto the femur itself. You want to remember, and I'm going to add a layer of connective tissue on here so you can see, is that it's kind of like the thigh is a wrapped sausage in this coating, which is just a fascia lata, and the the iliotibial band, excuse me, is just essentially a thickening of this global Tesco bag wrap of connective tissue that envelops the whole sort of thigh. That point is important. Let me highlight it again here, because traditionally, or for a long time anyway, we've thought of IT band syndrome as this kind of friction syndrome. And anatomically, it's kind of plausible if you think that this is just a disconnected belt that just, for want of a better term, that just runs down here, is just flipping and flopping around back and forth and causing friction on underlying structures. But it's actually pretty well rooted into the actual thigh bone and femur itself. So it's certainly not flapping around there as we perhaps once thought. The proposed kind of current model mechanism of injury in terms of why do we end up with pain from the IT band is that it's putting this squeeze on very pain sensitive structures that lie beneath it in this region down here. Some adipose tissue, highly innervated, highly capable of producing a lot of pain, and there's certain positions that we can end up in that are going to increase tension through the IT band and then start to put this squeeze on those sensitive structures underneath. So talking about the functional anatomy of the IT band, I want to go through its actions, and I'm going to use a couple of analogies here. The first one is energy storage. So I want you to think of the IT band as acting like a giant elastic band. So, for example, because it's primarily a runner's injury, when you're running, when you land, this elastic band is being stretched. It's storing up potential energy that's then released, just like flicking elastic band after you've stretched it when you go to push off. If you have a compliant or a loose, quotation marks, iliotibial band, then think of it as sort of a loose elastic band, so loose and stretchy, or thin one. So when you start to stretch that band, yeah, it will stretch quite easily, but then the recoil is pretty pitiful. It's kind of reduce speed, reduce force, it will just flop on the floor in front of you, right? Whereas if you think about a thick, tight elastic band, then there's less stretch, but it's going to recoil much faster. It's going to fly. And that's what you want ideally, because a lot of the treatments focus on this kind of concept of tight IT band, loosening it, which in reality isn't actually happening. I'll come on to that later. Releasing it, all these stretching it, all these kind of things, which are, to be honest, pretty ineffective. And if you understand the anatomy, if you understand running economy, where if you think of bouncing on a trampoline, where efficiency-wise, if the springs are taut, if you land, there's this just natural recoil and you go flying in the air. If it's loose, you land and it just sags, and then you have to, it's exhausting then to try and actually take off. That's analogous to that kind of loose elastic band, that loose IT band. So we're running in the wrong direction, pun not intended. The second role is that of a shield, protection. It works with some of the other structures on the outside of the knee, lateral collateral ligament, amongst others, to help stabilize us in the frontal plane. And you'll see that throughout the program, we don't just work, one of the principles is that work in multiple planes of motion, the frontal plane being one of them. All right, so what do we want to avoid? I should say a better term would be, what do we need to modify rather than avoid? But let's go through it now. Using the information, keeping in mind that elastic band analogy, and knowing that energy storage, so that stretching and release of the elastic band, is one of, if not the most strenuous type of load, stress that we're going to put through the IT band. The question we've got to ask is, what activities are, and variations of these activities, are going to increase that elastic band stretch and release strain the most? The first thing is running, okay? No prizes for guessing that one. First thing is running, but the variations, I mean, in terms of what if we change things around with running, the gradient, we're going uphill, downhill, etc. Trail running, uneven terrain, flat terrain. Should it be running on hard or softer surfaces? A lot of people think, oh, just impact will be, it's less impact equals better. Not necessarily here. So let's go through it. The first thing is the TFL muscle. If you cast your mind back to that hip flexor, eccentric loading, which is just that fancy term for lengthening under tension or a deceleration of that muscle, is going to increase when the hip extends, which is just when that leg comes back behind you. So on the trailing leg, which is often where people report that pain, so you're going downhill, there's going to be much more of that eccentric, that deceleration type of motion there. That's going to put a lot more strain through your IT band. Also, you tend to pick up pace, clearly, when you're having to control yourself going downhill. And the faster you're going is going to increase energy storage demands, that elastic band demand. All right. So that's one thing to bear in mind. If you are trail running, we're thinking about going downstairs, going downhill. Trail running is also a bit unique because often people's step width narrows, and that is going to create more of an angle. So if you think of we call it varus stress. Varus is just like, if you think of bow-legged kind of position, it's going to almost increase the IT band stress by putting more tension and stretch through it as it's undergoing that elastic band stretch and release at the same time. So if you flip that on its head, if you go, okay, so all of those, so downhill, going quicker, narrower step width increases the energy storage demand. What's going to decrease that? We basically flip on its head. So instead of going downhill, we'll go uphill. I particularly like treadmill as a modification here because there's no downhill involved. You don't have to go up a literal hill, then go, oh, I've got to come down now. Or get an Uber. So that's one thing. 8 to 10% gradient is often incline is often a good start, and it may well be walking initially as opposed to anything else. But that's not a bad shout to start off with. Not everyone's going to be able to do that. We won't be able to keep everybody necessarily running. Some people may have to bring back to a stationary bike as an option. But one thing that's cool about that treadmill incline modification is that there does seem to be this kind of impingement zone that happens around 30 degrees, that knee bend. So as you're just approaching that sort of full lockout, that tends to be where that varus moment, where that, just call it that increased stress moment on the IT band occurs. And you can keep yourself out of that, out of the worst of it if you're working uphill. The big thing there as well is that you take a lot of the energy storage out of it. If you're walking, if you're going uphill, that's dealt with a massive amount of the problem. So that is what you want to think about when it comes to what not to do and how you can modify and change it. So in conclusion, anatomy wise, the big three: origin of the muscle, the TFL, the iliac crest, top of the pelvis, and the glute max, that big old butt muscle, and inserting into the outside of the kneecap, the Gerdy's tubercle, and across the outer thigh up until the last kind of 5 to 7 centimeters before it inserts onto that Gerdy's tubercle. I wanted to show you a picture here of that. So there you go. You can see that point just on the outer aspect of the shin bone. There it is. Actions: the elastic band, energy storage. It's storing energy as you land and it's releasing it as you push off, and it works with those other outer stretches on the knee to protect the outside of the knee, particularly in the frontal plane. What are the most stressful activities for it? Running, worse downhill, worse faster. There's going to be some strain on the trail leg as well as the weight-bearing leg as well. So it's not a case that just avoiding impact worsens it. Indeed, it's more a case of gradient. So we know that downhill is going to be worse because it increases energy storage. It increases that eccentric loading, as we mentioned before. And so the remedy, the modification for that is going to be walking for one thing, uphill for one thing. Why? Because it's going to significantly reduce energy storage and release demands. It's going to keep us out of that IT band pinch zone that occurs towards that kind of 30 to 35 degree position of your knee bending. And modifications there, as I say, treadmill ideal, 8 to 10% gradient, so we don't have to come back down the hill we've got up, or low seat on a bike. So again, that's just because it will keep us out of that IT band impingement zone. So thanks again for tuning in, guys, and see you in the next video.